Hello class, and welcome to our presentation, Introduction to Confucianism. So what is Confucianism? Well, Confucianism is actually rather difficult to define, but just as a general definition, Confucianism refers to an East Asian religious tradition that seeks order and harmony at the social, political, and cosmic levels. Now, what in the world does that mean? Well, to further explain, Confucianism seeks order and harmony within the individual, that is, to well order one's drives, desires, thoughts, and feelings. In interpersonal relationships, that is, between individuals and the greater society, and between heaven and earth. So in other words, Confucianism is what we might call a holistic belief system, which believes that order and harmony should exist at all levels of existence, within the individual, within interpersonal relationships between people, within society, and even within the universe itself. Now, for order and harmony to exist in the world, human beings must become cultured and properly social. That is, Confucianism emphasizes learning, filial piety or respect for elders, social propriety, and participation in religious rites as central to the purpose of human life. Now, Confucianism is often regarded as a Chinese religious and kind of philosophical belief system, which it is. But although Confucianism originated in 6th century China, Confucian thought and practice has spread throughout East Asia. Indeed, in the 21st century, Confucian religious rites are primarily practiced in Korea and Taiwan. And the philosophical movement which eventually developed into what we know as Confucianism was founded by the Chinese sage Confucius and his students. And Confucius was not so much the founder of Confucianism as he was a philosopher and social reformer who wanted to return China to its golden age under the early Zhou emperors. So let's take a look at our timeline for some guidance. So as we can see here, Confucius and Lao Tzu, if he existed, were more or less contemporaries. And they both lived during what is referred to as the later Zhou dynasty. And as you may further recall from previous lectures, Lao Tzu and Confucius lived during what is called the Warring States period, or a Chinese civil war that lasted for over 2 centuries and basically ravaged Chinese civilization at the time. And both Lao Tzu and Confucius were concerned with ending this civil war. So what is the solution for Confucius? Well, for Confucius, the solution to the Warring States period was to return Chinese society to the golden age of the early Zhou dynasty. And according to Confucius, the early Zhou ruled according to what is called the way of heaven. Now, what is the way of heaven? Well, for later Confucian thinkers, the reality of heaven, or Tian, embodies the principle of Li, or orderliness or propriety. And Li is often synonymous with the force of Yang, whereas Earth is analogous to the force of Yin. So put simply, the aim of human life in Confucianism is to encourage the way of heaven, or Li or Yang, to order and regulate the way of Earth, or Yin. And in order for this to happen, human beings must cultivate Yi or Yang energy through learning and by practicing Confucian moral principles like Yi, Wen, Shu, etc., which of course we'll go into more detail in our next presentation. Now, the ideal person responsible for bringing such reform to society through learning and these moral principles is what is called the Junzi, or the gentleman or superior man. And again, we will learn more about the Junzi later. Now, for our purposes, there are 2 major collections of sacred texts in the Confucian tradition. The first collection is referred to as the Four Books, which contain the teachings of Confucius and his students. And this contains the famous book of Confucian sayings called the Analects, as well as other texts like the Great Learning, the Doctrine of the Mean, the Zongyong, and the Book of Mencius. Another major set of texts would be the Five Classics, also known as the Confucian Classics, which are basically a collection of China's classical cultural works, such as writings on Chinese history, religious rites, poetry, music, and religious or theological or kind of philosophical teachings. Now, Confucius, as we remarked earlier, is not necessarily considered to be the founder of Confucianism because in many respects he wasn't that original, in that many of his ideas come from classical kind of Chinese teaching. But nonetheless, he is the one who is kind of like the author or like the originator of what we might call like the Confucian system of thought. So with this in mind, he was a kind of founder in his own right. And therefore, as a quote-unquote founder, it is important for us to learn more about his life. So let's just spend a couple minutes and do that. So as we mentioned earlier, Confucius is a Chinese philosopher and social reformer. And when you look at images of Confucius, you'll see that he's dressed like a scholar, often looking like someone of the noble class. But one thing that's kind of interesting about Confucius is that he was actually born in poverty. His mother was a widow. They didn't have a lot of money. But nonetheless, his mother was determined for the young Confucius to be formally educated, and indeed he was educated by the local town tutor. And Confucius from an early age was quite passionate about learning. Indeed, there is a famous saying in the Analects that at the age of 15, Confucius says, "I set my heart on learning." And because of his gifts as a student, he also had a gift as a teacher. And between the ages of 20 and 50, Confucius earned a reputation as a gifted teacher, educating young men from the lower to middle class. But despite his talents as a teacher, Confucius always wanted to have a position in the government. And this didn't happen until rather late in life when, between the ages of 50 and 55, Confucius became the chief of police and then the advisor to the Duke of the province of Le. However, by the age of 55, Confucius became concerned with discovering a solution to the Warring States period. And from the ages of 55 to 67, Confucius traveled from province to province with his closest disciples, pitching his philosophy of good government to the ruling princes, but to little avail. In other words, his teachings received very little attention during his lifetime. And believing himself to be a failure, Confucius spent the last 5 years of his life editing the Confucian classics. But despite believing himself to be a failure, it is arguable that Confucius, over time, became the most influential sage in Chinese history.